Yeah, dear Dan, thank you very much for taking the time today to answer our questions. In short, you are development economist for real, so it's also your studies, I guess, I think. But you have, in addition, you have 25 years of practical on-the-ground experience, if I'm not wrong. You have worked in and for the United Nations in many countries as an advisor and also for the OECD, and now you're self-employed, if I'm not wrong. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
so yeah, long kind of varied career in international development as an economist. Yeah, exactly. I studied, actually, I did politics, philosophy, and economics as an undergrad, and then did master's degrees in, well, I did one in political theory, um, so kind of philosophy, let's say, and then another one in economics, and then my PhD was in more or less a combination of the two, sort of the
yeah.
philosophy of development economics.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was published as a book about 15 years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not. So basically, you're not an economist with a lot of math. Do I hear it right?
No, I did a lot of that in my
Okay.
master's degree, and then, but yeah, honestly,
Mm.
don't anymore. And I have
Yeah.
quite clear views about the sort of prevailing mainstream neoclassical model of economics, which tends to be highly formal and mathematical. Yeah,
Mm.
definitely clear views
Yeah.
about that, but
Right.
maybe I don't want to go into those too much right
But
now.
it makes it more convenient for economists, at least. They do not have to leave their office for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So, but yeah, can you just having a brief look? How can you be self-employed in this job? I guess it's somebody very puzzling because most economists to just go directly into institutions. What let's phrase it like this: what is your business model?
Yeah, no. So I have worked for quite a long time in international organizations, as you said, but also independently. And I consult a lot for the UN, for other entities, for governments as well. And they ask me to maybe go to a developing country. I particularly specialize in least developed countries, um, to research, write reports for governments on an independent basis, and essentially to support those governments with, well, I have specialized particularly in trade policy. And yeah, yeah, I work just as an independent consultant on development
Mm,
economics in countries around the world. So I worked in, like, as I say, like 25
mm,
countries or something across
mm,
well, Caribbean, Africa, East Asia, and the
right.
Pacific. Yeah.
Mm. I mean, the first question was puzzling me was, I mean, what is your perception on multilateral institutions? You have worked for many, you had many impressions of it. Even the OECD, they have a very nice, strong scientific research department, but also they're highly politicized organizations, I think. And yeah, I think we had just a brief chat via email about it, that you have a how efficient they work and what are the problems with it, or their functionality, their, let's say, their efficiency. If you can, of course, if you want to rephrase it a bit. Mm,
Yeah, no,
mm,
I think it's really important, and I'm glad you started with this issue of multilateralism because it's so vital in today's world. And of course, I'd start by saying, like, committed multilateralist. I absolutely believe in it. That's why I worked in the system and have done it, and I continue to work for many multilateral organizations because in a global world, you need coordination.
mm,
In a simple sort of game theoretical way, it things won't work unless there is a coordinator.
mm,
Um, it's you know to I think it was Dag Hammarskjöld, UN Secretary General, one of the most famous, prominent UN Secretary General, who said, the job of the UN is not to lead us to paradise, but to save us from hell. And maybe it's done that.
mm,
Maybe its success lies in its ability to have coordinated the world over the more than 70 years since its formation after the Second World War. So to start off with, I'd say, as broad as it is, and as large a topic as it is. The UN is completely essential, and multilateralism's good functioning would be vital for prosperity and for a stable and peaceful world order. So that's sort of the first thing to say. So if I'm critical, it's not sort of the concept or anything like
Mm.
that. It's because I want it to work better. Um, yeah, and I worked for UN as an advisor on the least developed countries for a few years, based in the Secretariat in New York. Also was in the OECD Development Center, so separate a bit from the main bit of the OECD, working on international development for a short period of time. And I've sort of thought hard about what's right and what's wrong, and sort of tried to diagnose a bit
Mm.
the issues that concern multilateralism in the UN in particular. And as I say, it's a huge topic. There are an enormous number of UN institutions, which is partly the problem, actually, too big, too sprawling and duplicative. But yeah, to kind of home in on my area, which is economic development, what you can see is that the fragmentation of the world order, of the global economy, has in some ways led to the fragmentation and the dysfunction of the UN itself, of the
Mm.
system. So it's not just Trump's bad, there's some kind of
Mm.
poor global leaders who happen to be disrupting it or underfunding it. The problems are deeper. It's connected with um, what some people call deglobalization. It dates back to the financial crisis and before. This fragmentation, um, competition among great powers, and the sort of splintering of the global economy or the global economic model that did exist before that. And you can see that the impact is therefore on
Mm.
the UN or on the system that's supposed to provide global governance. Um, and it definitely, well, it was failing before then, but it's certainly suffered significantly since this disruption to the global multilateral sort of economic model.
Mhm.
Um,
But
and what I would
maybe
say is,
might I
yeah, sorry,
interrupt you here?
yeah,
So we're talking about, let's say, you said it's not only Donald Trump, but I mean, we already seen the fracturing before, right? And I mean, you're still talking about the United Nations, even though I mean, like the WTO, it's has already big problems beforehand, before that. Also the IMF, I mean, and for
yeah.
many decades, I think it was a lot that it was very dominated by the United States. Uh, do you think that is also like, let's say, with the rise of China, of course, but also other emerging powers, that the West was not very tolerant or was not really in the mood of sharing power? So not only the United Nations, formerly everybody has, I think, their one voice, one country, one voice, but like in the IMF or in the or even United Nations, I mean, they're depending on donors, right? When you're talking about least developed countries, formally they have their votes, but in informal terms, they're depending on donors, right?
Yeah, I would say, okay, I guess, as I say, it's a huge sort of question and a big, complicated system, but let's try to generalize a bit. Um, Massive problem of the UN is the Security Council. I mean, the countries that won the Second World War are the only ones with permanent members.
Mm.
That's where power lies. I mean, if you want to see how an organization functions, any organization, look at where power lies and why and what are the sort of
Mm.
causes and so on. Well, the five countries that won the Second World War, it's completely out of date.
Mm.
There's no African countries, no Latin American countries. The only Asian one is China that has a permanent uh, seat on the Security Council.
Mm.
It's kind of ridiculous. And it's no wonder that
And
countries are starting to get anxious or dispute what it says or question its
uh,
legitimacy.
mm.
Um,
Uh,
the veto power lies only with those countries out of
mm.
date on
Because
the UN side. Yeah,
especially like countries like France or Great Britain, what what gives them the status right today, right? I mean, back then they had big colonial empires, kind of ruled the world, but now they're just medium countries among many medium countries, I guess. Uh,
yeah, medium and perhaps declining.
mm,
Carney famously last year, or this year, actually, earlier this year, talked of, the middle powers. That's all they are, I mean,
Yeah.
right now. What on earth, are they doing with such unmovable influence, unshakable influence on the multilateral system? And it's a big cause of its decline. So that's there's a lot more to say about the UN, but I think a lot of issues are connected to the power relations that underlie the UN, the Security Council, and sort of emanate out like waves from that
Mm,
fundamental problem of illegitimate power. The IMF is kind of like medieval pre-democratic organization in the way it is organized. So it's the World Bank. It's like when in the UK, before the Great Reform Act in 1832, you used to only be allowed to vote if you had property. The vote share is divided up
mm,
based on how much you contribute to the organization, and therefore the US is the most powerful. It's not democratic. And of course, again, it raises major questions over its legitimacy. And many countries that are the subject of IMF advice or policy um, react against it or
mm,
question its neutrality, let's
mm,
say. So again, big powers dominate it,
mm,
dish out advice and activities without really the sort of fundamental democratic norm that you would expect in other sensibly set up institutions.
mm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so how if you would restructure them, so you would just give them more like you would run them more like a technocracy, or because although you would reshuffle the voting powers, because then you come into the big issue. I mean, is it one man, one vote? I mean, Western countries will never accept that. I mean, we will be outvoted, and we are always right, so we cannot be overruled by by autocracies or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
No, and it's uphill battle for the majority world.
yeah.
Um, of course, power relations are always paramount. It's not as if these countries are sort of, the grip of these countries over the multilateral institutions of economic development is sort of prized open easily.
Mm,
But it's not unrealistic. I mean, pretty much everybody acknowledges that the
mm,
Security Council is outdated, that it isn't representative. Everybody knows that. It's becoming increasingly clogged up.
mm,
Security Council resolutions are falling in recent years, so it just doesn't work. Many of the countries that even, I think, the UK, probably France, they know probably
mm,
their days are numbered
mm,
in that respect. Um, so, yeah, the point is known. It's what to do about it and how realistic change is, as always.
mm,
But it does seem to me that with the rise of the global south, um, which is a phenomenon, I mean, for sure, economic activity and global power is shifting south. It isn't unrealistic to expect genuine change. And if, the incoming Secretary General and the sort of bigwigs at the UN want the institution to remain relevant, it will have to be properly, radically reformed, or just slip away into obscurity, or
mm,
it'll be overcome, which it
mm,
already actually is to some extent in many
mm,
areas. Similarly, IMF, I mean, you're going to see things like the BRICS Plus financial institutions, the other development banks being set up by countries in the global south, rivaling it, becoming more capitalized and um, overtaking it,
mm,
unless it's given some degree of democratic legitimacy. So I don't hold up much hope. I'm not making any predictions here, but I don't think it's unrealistic to see some degree of reorientation of power relations in these kinds of institutions that aligns with changes going on in the modern world.
So, I mean, I jump ahead. Actually, it was my final question, but yeah, of course, when we're talking about the global south, I mean, we're talking about China. I mean, it has the power to challenge this system how it is. And it's not only, I mean, the Security Council, I guess it's losing relevance, but also China is building up parallel institutions, basically with the banks, with the development banks. There's plenty of it. It's not only one. It's not so to rival the IMF or the WTO, which is basically blockaded. How do you see that? I mean, first of all, I mean, we're economists, so we always say competition is a good thing. But of course, also it comes with some caveats. I mean, China, how much is China using this new power, let's say, also for pushing its interests? Is it comparable anyways to the US? Is it worse? Does it export its autocratic model, or does it leave the freedoms to countries? I mean, they are always very eager on non-interference, but of course, I mean, one is a label, the other thing is the reality. How do you assess that?
Yeah, one of the things I keep thinking about is with respect to China and contemporary events is the maxim of never interrupt your enemy when he's making a
Mm.
mistake. Um, and you can say that China's enemies, in inverted commas, are making major mistakes right now.
Mm.
They don't need to do much. And by default, I would think that their relative role will increase in political economic terms. Um, so, insofar as I have a strategy, it doesn't seem as though it's particularly, let's say, uh, deliberative, aggressive, expansionist at the moment, but it can still succeed. Um, so, I don't know. Another thing to say about the China and the UN is that uh, it well, China benefited hugely from the type of globalization that we had until and probably through the financial crisis. So it supported multilateralism um, to a great extent. Um, it joined the WTO. That's great. In some ways, sort of created the seeds of the economic boom or continued the boom. And China has obviously been keen to sort of assert its influence in the multilateral sphere. It's the second biggest funder of the UN.
Mm.
It funds lots of isolated ad hoc programs in a sort of subtle way that I think outsiders wouldn't see. Its influence is spread throughout the organization. But as you sort of hinted, it's not necessarily a great thing because it's not a democracy. I mean, it's
Mm.
uh, you know
Mm.
Xi
But
Jinping's in power for life. We don't want that model exported to the world, or I don't think most of the world does. So it's at the same time, impressive to watch the expansion of the Chinese
mm.
sort of influence, but also worrying and scary and kind of opposed to
Mm.
many of the principles that built multilateralism. So a little bit of a
Mm.
depressing thing
Oh,
to
okay.
to see in a way.
Mm. Because also I heard the story that the Chinese strategy is more to enter these multilateral organizations and reform them from the inside, but then it faced or encountered so much blockade so that it just started, okay, I go off and found my own. How do you agree with this
Yeah, I reckon
point of
it's doing
view?
both.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it is doing that. And I mean, what's the cost really to trying both strategies? Um, so let's say when I was at the UN Secretariat, you could see
Mm.
the place was basically filling up with officials from Beijing.
Mm.
And there was a lot of Chinese Belt and Road money there. Um, they spent $1 trillion over a decade on this One Belt, One Road program, and they were sort of blue washing it through the UN. I could see that.
Blue
Um,
washing.
Blue washing, meaning putting the UN stamp on it
Mhm.
to make it look legitimate, to
Okay.
make it look sort of above board and multilateral, let's say.
Hmm.
That was going on. But at the same time, as you say, other parallel power structures were being built and are being. So they win either way. Um, you both shape and influence and sort of infiltrate, not a great word, the UN or multilateral structures, but also uh, do other, create other power structures and influence those. So if one strategy fails, the other is the backup. And I don't know, a very, I guess, a different um, argument or a different example of this is in trade. They're really, or have been really pro WTO, much more so than the United States in recent years. Um, so they're really multilateral in trade in many ways, but they're also doing loads and loads of bilateral trade deals with individual countries and regionals being involved in, yeah, particularly Asian regional trade integration. So they do both, and WTO is clearly not going anywhere. It's in deep trouble, but it's not particularly costly to continue to engage there for China, but also do do bilateral trade deals and regionals and pursue other avenues of um, trade.
Hmm. So let's say from this competition, what is in for small states? I mean, we talked about, I mean, it's not export, it's, let's say China is not exporting democracy, but at least it's stability. And when we looked at what happened in the recent decades, I mean, from all the democratization efforts, I mean, look, Sudan, Myanmar, wherever, everywhere where we try to export our democratic model, they basically fell apart and ended up in civil wars. So China is much more into stability. Can't we just assess this also as kind of a positive thing? They
Yeah,
were
I
like,
mean, okay, let's use the example of South Sudan. So I worked in South Sudan
oh, sorry, I
about,
was not about South Sudan, about Sudan after the revolution of
sorry, oh, you
2019.
said Sudan, but I was saying, I mean, okay, next door, because it's a country I've worked in,
Mm,
the the sort of naive hopes of the West or Europe for newly independent South Sudan came crashing down in, was it 2013, where the place erupted into civil war. I was working there just before that, and there was obviously a competition between China and the West to get the oil. And um, what South Sudan needed was not a sparkling constitution full of human rights perfection from some North European consultant. It was roads and food um, and water.
mm,
I remember being in Juba and watching these trucks going to the river or to a reservoir, trundling along and pumping it into people's uh, own personal water tanks in the capital. There's no running water. I mean, prior to that, I had colleagues who worked there. There were no hotels. There were people, visitors had to stay in tents. Anyway, so it didn't need initially
mm,
these sort of idealistic Western um, institutions, or at least on paper, it it needed the basics, and China maybe supplied those. And I'm not saying that's great because it also comes with complete disregard for human rights and equality and the things that we value as ends in themselves. But I, I would say people from South Sudan uh, were probably more happy with the things that China was providing, basically cash
mm,
and roads, than the sort of some of the things that the West, in inverted commas, was coming up with. Anyway, I only use that as an example of the sort
Yeah.
of dilemma
Very
in
nice.
some
Mm,
countries between, what Europe has exported and what China's done. And yeah, I don't know. Does China provide stability? Well, maybe if it's the sort of building blocks of development. Also, China's recently successfully done development, so it kind of knows how it's done. The model is
mm,
perhaps more readily absorbed by middle income or low income or least developed
mm,
countries
mm,
than the model that's sort of exported by the West. Yeah, so whether or not it's better to have China or not is a difficult question, but
mm,
the reality is that it can often provide the things that people immediately need
mm.
in particularly low income and least developed countries. Yeah.
You're providing this nice example of South Sudan. So my next question will address theory and practice of development aid. I mean, how do you assess that? I mean, is it very academically driven? I studied development economics myself, and well, which were in Göttingen, which is a very, very nice place for this. But on the other hand, I was mostly it was driven by, as you said, Northern European perspectives. And even there, most of the people who self-selected in there, they were even the well-off of Germans who self-selected into development economics. How do you assess this from your work in the field? Is it going is it diverging from your experiences, what they are saying or what their research topics are? Can you can you just
Yeah.
emphasize on that?
Yeah, no, definitely. And interesting you raised. It's a really good question and a good line of inquiry. And I think all credit to you for sort of having realized, so to speak, or sort of noticed this thing, because not everybody does. Um, so I wrote a book about economics, and it was based on my experience, sort of having studied it in a really mainstream. I was at Edinburgh doing my mainstream economics masters, and not to criticize the people who taught it or the course itself. I mean, maybe like you, Göttingen, um, everybody was acting with the best of intentions, really clever people, credibly academically talented. But then I went off to one of the poorest countries in the world at the time, really peripheral place. Nobody had ever heard of, including me, before I went there, and found out that most of what I'd learned was pretty irrelevant, to be honest.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, so the country was Vanuatu in the South Pacific, and I was an advisor to the government basically for 2 years for the Overseas Development Institute as a fellow. And I quickly realized that I didn't know anything. And you go in there, sort of parachute in, full of all these big ideas, as this young economist, thinking you're going to dispense wisdom. And actually, I think the wisdom was dispensed in the other direction. Not to say, yeah, I don't know, but I learned more, I think, than they learned from me.
Mm,
You were given all these abstract tools that had been constructed very much in the Western academic tradition and said, oh, go and use them. Comparative advantage, this country did not trade according to the Ricardian comparative advantage. Trying to teach this stuff, and they're like, that's not really how things work here. It's power that matters here. We're tiny and we have no influence and we don't make anything. All anybody wants from us is our coconuts. And if we are locked into that particular area of comparative advantage, then we're screwed over the long run. We're not going to develop.
mm,
Um, you know, so anyway,
mm,
that was what motivated me to write about this sort of stuff. About the the difficulty of the sort of Western neoclassical mainstream economic tradition of incorporating practice into its worldview, into its models. And I very much thought, look, we're sort of being taught this one size fits all stuff, and it doesn't fit all. If you actually go there and find out and ask people, you'll realize that the sort of assumptions of the mainstream models don't hold. Um, and I
Mm,
just sort of turned upside down what I think I had learned in the academy. And yeah, so a bit more to answer your question. Do I think that this stuff works? And is it how things play out in sort of development policy and practice? No, I don't. I think, yeah, a lot of it's
mm,
just ignored.
mm,
And,
mm,
it's much more power and reality and realpolitik and, um, pragmatism that win out in the end. And that the more you can base your economic policy recommendations, or the more government can base its own decisions in just what works in pragmatism on the ground reality, the better. The
mm,
more it can really take into account the sort of learnings, context, social environment, motivations, values of its own context, the better. And that often
mm,
diverges from what
mm.
sort of mainstream economic academic models suggest.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it was like I was. It was an interesting story how I stumbled into economics. It was I found the wealth of nation in an Egyptian library where already was clear that I will go travel south of Africa, and
Right.
then I read Adam Smith and Ethiopia. I said, okay, wow, that's I mean, it's Scotland. I think 1770 something. But everything, much of what he was writing back there, of the rationality that's going on, I said, okay, you can find it somehow here again, right? I mean, developing country, probably similar state. And then I started university economics. I said, what is going on here? So, that's- but but on the other
Yeah,
hand, there
yeah.
there might be also another side. I mean, many NGOs often they do not have any economic background at all. Often their business models are even run on not really to achieve something on the in the location, but to please donors at home. How do you assess this industry?
That's true as well. I mean, I think the one of the downsides of the rise in aid and official development assistance over the decades um, has been that they sort of bought off a lot of NGOs, and they all were scrabbling to get government funding, and therefore kind of maybe often compromised their own interests or their values. So they sort of became like just mini consultancies,
Mm,
doing what governments wanted. That's a sad reality. And as to could some of them do with a bit more economics? Yeah, I think so. And there's lots of really great economics. Like if you
mm,
actually explore it, the sort of heterodox tradition is full of brilliant thinkers that aren't always reflected in mainstream curricula. Some of my heroes from the 20th century are Anatol Kalecki, who basically invented Keynesianism before Keynes,
mm,
Polish
mm,
economist, because it wasn't translated in English. Yeah, Albert Hirschman, he's not always taught in universities. Um, some of these guys, the structuralist tradition, through to Ha-Joon Chang today, I think is a brilliant economist. Um, so yeah, does the NGO industry always use enough economics or act in a way that's sort of consistent with scientific principles? No, and I think a bit more, yeah, systematic
mm,
thinking and attention to economic realities would be
mm,
really helpful for that industry. But
mm.
yeah,
But I guess it's also comes also up with the interactions. This, I mean, you having on the one hand, you're having this NGOs. On the other hand, you're having the shortfalls in multilateral institutions that often orders they're contracting with them. So you're having a kind of a, I don't know, can you call it a toxic relationship that brings up a dynamic that is not really productive. Can we describe it like this? Would you agree on that?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, you could say that. I think it's not always healthy what's going on. You've got, you know, I'm not sort of universally criticizing everything that happens everywhere kind of thing. I don't want to come across as some doom merchant, but yeah, I think what you say
Mm,
is is valid. Yeah, in many contexts. But again, of course, there are some great NGOs with wonderful people with
mm,
the best of intentions, well motivated and doing good things. They're all different, really diverse landscape. And again, also within the multilateral world, there are very great many excellent, highly educated, well motivated people. And I often think about UN organizations and so on that they end up being less than the sum of their parts. And it, sort of the opposite of what's supposed to happen
mm,
because they're mismanaged and their incentives are wrong. They're all scrabbling around for the
mm,
resources and tend to do what's in the institutional interest rather than in the interest of the thing they're supposed to be dealing with. So yeah, loads of brilliant people, but sometimes crushed by terrible management and
mm.
misaligned incentives.
Yeah, we're dealing with Ukraine right now a lot, and you can tell the story also on a national level, I guess, there. So, but let me jump forward a little bit because Vanuatu was the name, right? Do I pronounce it
Yeah.
right? Yes, because I think you're one of the few persons I know who are dealing with small island developing states. So basically, what was your strategy you came up with them or with other small island states? What makes them so specific? I mean, you already went a bit into detail. This Ricardian thing doesn't work for them. But what is the problem? Do we have a solution for it besides transfers, or how would you assess that?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess if it's interesting to talk about my background there. Um, so a long time, 25 years or so ago, I was sent off to Vanuatu as this um, advisor basically to government. Really fantastic, life-changing experience. Um, I went on to do trade diagnostic work in pretty much all of the Pacific official least developed countries. Spent quite a lot of time in Solomon Islands, Samoa, um, even Kiribati, Tuvalu, several others. And I have been lucky enough to go back to Vanuatu over the years. People don't know, it's a small country in Melanesia to the west of Fiji, south of Solomon Islands, off the coast basically of about 3 hours flight to Brisbane. Um, yeah, and sort of lucky enough to work in these countries over the years. And yeah, I mean, they're tiny and marginalized and uh, simultaneously not really economically diverse or dynamic through no fault of their own, and also being destroyed by climate breakdown. Um, sea level
Mm.
rise and the devastating effects of periodic hurricanes is making their problem existential. I mean, they may not exist. Tuvalu will probably sink in a few years. Kiribati the same. It's going to wipe out
Maybe short,
cultures.
what dimension of population we're talking about? Hundred thousands or millions even?
Yeah, so the
Mm,
biggest is Papua New Guinea with, well, nobody really knows what the population is, but let's say 10 million. The
mm,
census is not necessarily that accurate, but 10 million Papua New Guinea. Next biggest is Fiji with 1 million. Um, yeah, and then others are obviously in the hundreds of thousands, down to
mm,
Tuvalu with about 10,000. And there are smaller than that, Niue, Nauru, Tokelau, so on. Really, really tiny microstates. And it's sort of, with respect to economic theory, it is a bit weird to talk about the usual concepts
Mm.
in, you know,
Oh,
the
yeah.
whole Pacific economy, if you add them all up, is like a European town in terms of GDP.
Hmm.
Um, you know, they're really tiny, and all the sort of usual models that we
Mm.
use, or the sort of concepts and so on, are of marginal relevance in most of them.
Mm.
Maybe not the big ones,
Okay.
but
Yeah,
yeah, you
but
have to think specifically about them, about the countries and the
mm,
situations on their merits.
mm,
You know, which relates to what I was saying earlier about economic theory, about the importance of context. Yeah, I mean, and what's the answer? Well, yeah, not easy, and maybe we need another podcast for that. But um,
mm.
what's clear is that trade's really difficult because they're thousands of miles from anywhere.
that
Transport's
that e-
sporadic, expensive.
that even makes tourism difficult, I guess. I mean, they're
Yeah, yeah,
beautiful, but they're so heavy and expensive to reach.
yeah, massively so. I mean, some have had a tourism boom. Fiji's really, popular tourism destination. Vanuatu itself actually did have a boom for sort of a couple of decades in tourism. Some, given the flights and so on and the right infrastructure, have managed to sort of benefit from tourism, but it's just a really difficult, almost intractable economic problem. And I I think you hinted in the right direction in that don't let's pretend that they're one day going to become aid independent and somehow,
Mm,
you know, normally in inverted commas functioning market economies in any way, anything like most of the rest of the world. They're not. They're going to be somewhat dependent on transfers, probably indefinitely. Um, and that doesn't just mean handouts, but some of them have got trust funds, for example. Tuvalu and Kiribati have got quite well-run trust funds based overseas that pay out when they make loads of money and don't when they don't. So it sort of supports economic activity, um, on top of the other sort of other sources, which are few and far between. But yeah, transfers are definitely going to
mm.
remain
Uh,
a key part of their economic story for
mm.
years to come, if not forever.
But can they even serve something like transfer payments for like saving the biodiversity, or that they can serve as a reserve? There are ideas sprawling out in this direction too.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And they are excellent stewards of the Pacific Ocean.
Mm,
I've worked a lot on fisheries subsidies negotiations at the WTO, and worked with the Pacific Islands on that. And one of the things they consistently and rightly say is that the Pacific is the only ocean that's not overexploited, that hasn't basically been emptied of fish. And it's because of their good stewardship, the systems they set up to ensure ocean sustainability work. And we should pay as humankind to protect that.
mm.
It's an end in itself. It's not handouts. It's our collective future. I mean, obviously, you turn the globe to that side and it's all blue. Two-thirds
Yes,
of the world
true.
is
Yeah.
basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so if we're thinking collectively as humankind, we probably ought to consider, uh,
Mm,
yeah, supporting it
mhm. Well,
through the economic activity
mm,
that we generate. Um, so yeah, things like that. I think
mm.
it's a good point.
Okay. So, but let's say the prospects are, let's say it's not prospering, but they will always rely on the world community to uphold a certain living standard.
I think it's also a bit wrong to generalize too
Mm.
much because there's
Of course.
well more 14 countries that are in the official Pacific Islands Forum, and more some semi-independent ones. They're all different. Some are probably more autonomous than others. Um, but yeah, there's and we're all part of the global community. We all sort of depend and all interlinked in some way or another. Plus, um, aid's political and it's a Pacific's definitely, a site of ongoing and probably intensifying competition among the big powers. And it will inevitably, the region will inevitably be aid dependent for that reason or
Mm.
influenced by the spending of other big powers. It's sort of inevitable. So
Mm.
it's not really, it's a bit of a moot question, really.
Mm.
No, no. But also, I mean, on
Mm.
sort of on the Pacific, I thought, yeah, I think it's a sort of test case of do we care really about the most vulnerable people and countries in the world
Mm.
or not? And you know, these are such marginalized and sort of distant places um, that although they don't necessarily hit the headlines or they're not full of people on extremely low incomes, yeah, they are definitely examples of total marginalization. And yeah, raise the question of do we care? Or
Mm.
like does the world sort of look after its most marginalized or not?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, coming back a bit to development aid in general, uh, I came up with the example of an ambassador of Kenya. She was close to begging. She's asking for investment, not development aid. Um, However, it seems they do not really get it. Or what is your take on that? Uh, do we think? I mean, if you look at the stock market, I mean, they're rising, but of course, emerging markets also rising. But I don't know if there's sufficient investment is coming in countries or developing countries. Uh, what do you
Yeah,
do you see that too, or is it just misconception? And if not, if
no,
why?
I
What?
mean, so again, it depends on where you're talking about. I mean, there's many countries that basically didn't get any at
Mm.
all. I mean, just
Yeah.
you don't go
Mm.
there. You wouldn't. They don't have stock markets, or you certainly wouldn't invest in one as a foreigner. Um, and then there are other so-called emerging markets or frontier markets that are perhaps more possible destinations for investment. That's in terms of equity flows, short-term capital flows. Um, in terms of FDI, yeah, as well. I mean, well, you don't necessarily want hot money that flows out again at a moment's notice, any sign of trouble. Um, and in terms of FDI, yeah, they don't get enough. Um, Broadly speaking, often it's in resource industries, extractive industries, or it's there for cheap labor. If Bangladesh might be an example, let's say. Um, so is it often to generalize the right kind of investment? Not always. I mean, rarely is it investment that's genuinely there for the good of the country or to bring countries up the value adding ladder. And often it's destabilizing and often it's insufficient. Um, so, yeah, sort of exclusion from global capital flows as being an ongoing, persistent problem of the developing world since time immemorial continues to be so. And but it is what they all want. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, aid to Africa was never very high anyway, and it's going right down. The sorts of levels of official development assistance that existed were no substitute for productive investment and
Mm.
capital flows. And African leaders and people know that and want investment. They don't want handouts. They want
Mm.
genuine, productive investment in their businesses, and so yeah.
Yeah. But even though the economist wrote that um, that even though that development aid is drying up, that Africa seems to be very resilient on that. I mean, I talked to somebody else who said the continent is so pessimistic, he's never seen that before. But how would you say that? That's this showing this resilience, and do you think they can catch up with growth again?
Whether or not they could catch up again, I don't know. But yeah, it is pretty amazing how resilient the continent seems to have been. There are lots of initiatives that seem to suggest consolidation. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, the African Union, sort of more muscular and prominent and consolidated that used to be. Um, Regions seem to be getting their acts together to some extent. Um, and there's definitely a sort of seems to be, I mean, I'm outsider, but there seems to be a greater sense of self-reliance, coherence, coordination, and this sort of spirit of getting things done despite the rest of the world, um, and not sort of blaming outsiders for the problems if ever that did happen. Um, so yeah, it is quite amazing and pretty impressive to see the resilience of many people in the continent and economies.
If I'm not wrong, or if I didn't follow it closely, but I mean, this Nigerian, call it oligarch, Dangote, I think he's now taking big advantage of this oil crisis. So he's building refineries all over the continent. Something like this happening. If it might be wrong on that. I just read the headlines. It was quite kind of fascinating that. I mean, Nigeria is one of the biggest oil producers, but that doesn't really refine anything itself. It's importing the oil products. So,
Yeah,
my,
no, yeah.
mm,
I mean, uh, I'm not a Nigeria expert by any means, but yeah, maybe that's an example of what I was talking about.
mm. But however, when we're talking, we already went into the more detail of the fractionalization of world trade. Of course, many countries wanted to copy paste somehow this Chinese model, so step by step going up the value chain ladder. Turkey did it somehow, Bangladesh did it somehow, I think Senegal, just to name a few examples, even though there are plenty of more there. Um, but now with the fractionalization of value chains, I mean, that's, I guess, it's your topic. How do you assess it that those countries can they still copy this Chinese model, even under these trade conditions how they are now? I mean, Western countries are very reluctant nowadays towards imports. Let's say they want to bring back production home, friendshoring, nearshoring, homeshoring. Um, how would you assess this? Maybe you can also give out examples which you had a closer look.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think many of them really copied the Chinese model. In so far as they're seeking to pursue an export-led model, I suppose you could say yes. And economic zones are really popular in many countries. That's a sort of obviously that was one of the main legs of the Chinese development process. Um, Infrastructure development, yeah, I guess so. But yeah, I mean, very, very different. And is the Chinese model, so to speak, replicable elsewhere in radically different contexts? I don't think so. Um, the big thing about China and many countries that actually succeeded is that you cross the river by feeling for the stones,
Mm,
which, Chinese proverb itself. But everything has to be adapted to context and
mm,
um, is seen in light of the characteristics that your country has. Things have to be developed carefully and pragmatically. So, in the sense that that's sort of Chinese, and yeah, maybe they are,
mm.
but it does really vary a lot according to
Of course.
country and context. And is a trade-led model possible? Let's sort of try and answer that question. Not as much as it was, and can countries copy the East Asian model? No, I don't think so. I mean, garments are not necessarily accessible as a sort of first leg on the ladder anymore. Even Bangladesh is struggling there. Um, you know, the sort of stages theory of industrialization seems to be incredibly difficult, uh, given the changes going on in the global economy. So to sort of replicate this trade or export led model is extremely difficult nowadays for many others. In fact,
Mhm.
probably isn't doesn't exist anymore.
Mm. Because I
Yeah,
mean, the Chinese model also but was learning by doing from Western technologies, for example, and adjusting them for their own
yeah,
context, adapting them, and this is not so feasible because just Western countries they're not so open for this anymore, and they're more protective nowadays. But what alternative models do you see for them? Do you see? Of course, we're still talking about generalizations, but can you can you somehow give some direction or see a direction? What can
yeah. I
work?
mean, yeah. Um, well, China itself is a source of investment, massive, of trade and investment for
Mm.
Africa and for many developing countries.
But
Um,
but even they are now constrained with the credit bubbles, so also this is lowering.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, I don't know. An example is Africa got tariffed by Trump big time, and many of these countries suffered enormously. Let to pick out the likes of Madagascar, Lesotho, a couple of others. Essentially their export industries were severely disrupted, if not shut down, by the Trump tariffs. What did China do? It it made the whole of Africa duty free, quota free, and all least developed countries around the world to try and uh, build links with the countries that have just become sort of relatively disconnected with Africa. As I say, the Belt and Road, just massive, almost unprecedented infrastructure development program in history. Again, it ties the global south to China. Um, um, in terms of investment, some people I've spoken to say that the kinds of Chinese investment in Africa and other parts of the global south are more suitable for those contexts. It's sometimes sort of intermediate technology, but basic, or not even basic, but cheaper, um, perhaps less advanced technologies that are suitable for those contexts, as opposed to the kind of stuff coming out of the high-end Western countries. So yeah, I think there are ongoing and sort of growing links between China and these other countries, and yeah, whether there's models, different question, but I definitely think that sort of the influence in the global south of China is something something that will continue and grow over years ahead. But I do think that many of the countries that have sort of experimented with, let's say, Washington Consensus and the post-Washington Consensus,
Mm.
are now becoming more pragmatic and turning to other examples, and adapting them to their own contexts.
Mm. But I think also many global South countries they're quite still quite skeptical, and there's a lot of mistrust towards those Western policies. I think about CBAMs that they're already talking about green colonialism and stuff like this. Buzzwords like this were coming up. Uh, so
Yeah,
so right now you think that China is having a quite more stake in the global South than the West? Would you?
I think so. Yeah, purposefully. I mean, they want the resources and the cheap labor, and they want the power. Um, I absolutely think so. And I think where the West pulls out, China moves in. I mean, I don't think there's much real secret about that. And as you say, I mean, something like CBAM, the complaint of many of particularly the least developed countries that I work with is that they were not consulted. It's just like, well, take it or leave it.
Mm,
We're going to basically tariff you if you want to export things to us. It is basically a trade barrier, whatever they say.
mm,
Um, but we're not going to ask you. We're not going to consult you. Yeah, they delayed it a little bit, but that's the extent of their kindness. And again, this will alienate politicians and people in the global south.
mm. Thank you very much. I think I asked everything I wanted to ask, and I think we're also approaching the end, so it's good timing. So yeah,
Yes.
thank you very much for your time. It was very nice talking to you.